Thank you once again. This is the Business Technology Summit 2022 session for Microsoft Purview for compliance and data governance.
Yeah, my name is Hector. I'm part of the cloud practice here at JourneyTEAM. I've been at JourneyTEAM for almost 7 years and deal with everything related to Microsoft 365, their Azure and Access, and identity management related feature set, security and compliance, which is the topic of this session. So lots of projects within those realms is what we focus on. Anyways, excited to share some knowledge with you all, and hopefully we can bring some value to some of what you're looking for.
Yep, I'm Reese Briggs. Learned a lot from Hector over the years, a lot in the data loss prevention space and how organizations are functionally implementing and putting in place policies to protect them from unique scenarios to their business. Excited to dive in and show some configuration with you later.
And I'm Ben Taylor. I'm on our collaboration and content management team, primarily working with SharePoint and Teams, but also in the compliance space of retention and information protection. So excited to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Well, let's dive right in. So here is the overall agenda for this session. We'll start off by kind of giving a high-level intro to what Microsoft Purview is, the reason you even should think about the feature set related to Microsoft Purview, reasons behind it, and then we'll dive into the different components of Purview, starting off with information protection and the features there. I'll be talking about that. We'll switch over to Reese, and he'll cover data loss prevention functionality. And we'll finish off with Ben talking about data lifecycle management. Purview as a whole is not limited to these features or feature sets. There are several others. Obviously, don't have time to tackle all of those during today's session, but these are ones that I would say are really high on organizations' lists of getting implemented just due to current events, things that are going on in the world today in relation to regulations, which we'll talk about here in just a second. So just know that there are more features and feature sets tied to compliance, which is essentially what Microsoft Purview is all about. But these are the ones that we'll focus on today. At the very end, we'll hopefully have a little bit of time for Q&A. Even then, if you have a question as we're going through these different agenda items here, please post your questions, etc., in chat, and we have team members here that can answer questions if we're not able to right off the bat during the presentation. Okay. All righty. So why is Microsoft Purview important? Let's talk a little bit about that. So to give a little bit of context and understanding around why this is important to you, and in this session, I'm sure we have maybe some that are involved as upper management or technical resources within your organizations, or maybe you're just curious about what this is all about. The reason I mention that is because I want everybody to kind of put on their business owner hats to just kind of understand why this would be important to you, even though in your current role, they may not be as pertinent to worry about and to really have to implement or operationalize within your organization. With that said, this is something that you all know. There's an explosion of data. There's data being created all over the place, right? In your personal life, in your business or corporate environments. There's files, there's emails, all of that information is being shared internally, is being shared with external parties. And where this starts to get interesting and nuanced is when we start to think about sensitive information. And again, we deal with that in our personal lives, right? We probably bank using remote tools and things like that. We log into multiple systems and we email sensitive information sometimes. You know, we're going through purchasing a home, things like that. There's information just going back and forth between different parties. And so all of that information, structured and unstructured, in a corporate environment is becoming more and more difficult to understand where that data resides, where it should go. If there's no processes that are pointing people to where they should be uploading and saving specific types of data, you know, you're unsure where all of those things are floating around. So that's a challenge, or one of the challenges, right? But the whole data landscape of just understanding there's just a ton of data. One little data point, IDC, International Data Corporation, estimates that by 2025, in that year, there'll be 163 zettabytes of data that are created. That's 10 to the 21st power worth of data. And that's a tenfold increase of data that was created back in 2016. So you can imagine, just with everything being digitized more and more, cloud-based solutions increasing, all of those things, that's a lot of data that's going to be floating around. Okay, so as a business owner, you operate in the United States or somewhere around the world, or you do business with organizations, businesses, corporations that are all across the globe, right? Why is this important? Well, there's policies, there's laws that you have to live by. You have to have some governance in your digital workspaces to protect you from potentially going against those regulations, right? There's a growing number of regulations that we've seen over the past few years. We have GDPR, many are familiar with. We have CCPA, the California Protection Act, right? A lot more that are becoming more relevant for US-based companies as well. So why is this important? Well, the cost for not complying with these privacy regulations, laws, etc., could result in fines, withdrawal of licenses, lower credibility with regulators and ultimately your customers, right? If you have a data breach and there is a law protecting people in that part of the world, or like California, this part of this country, there are hefty fines if a person were to sue that organization. And those add up, right? If there's a breach and others are affected. So very, very important to understand data within your organization and to protect it and to govern it. And that's why Microsoft Purview is becoming a very important tool set. There's three big challenges that I'd just like to highlight here. So 88% of organizations don't have a lot of confidence in being able to detect and prevent loss of sensitive data. Okay. More than 80% of corporate data is quote unquote dark. Okay, we don't know where that's at, what it's classified as technically. Even if we do know where it's at, it may not have the correct governance features around it to control that type of data from being shared by accident or internally to parties that shouldn't have access to it. And then another concern is just protecting and governing sensitive data, just as a whole. To comply with regulations essentially is challenging. It's a months-long, years-long effort, right? It's not just an overnight thing that happens. So it's important if you have some sort of role that crosses the spectrum of either handling sensitive data or your company really is the data steward over a lot of sensitive data, customer data, client data. This is very pertinent to you all. So Microsoft Purview, like where does this play in this whole arena? Microsoft Purview is a rebrand that Microsoft had at the very end of last year. They renamed and rebranded a bunch of their solutions and really tacked on the term Microsoft Purview right at the beginning of a lot of them. So a lot of the solutions that we'll talk about today, you've known them just like as an example, information protection. Cool. Well, they tacked on Microsoft Purview information protection. And so that just basically bringing everything under the house of compliance. Microsoft Purview is just a pretty marketing name. Within Microsoft Purview, though, you'll see that there's two big buckets here. There's a risk and compliance solution set, which is really the focus of this session. That covers Microsoft 365 solutions like Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, Exchange, and a few others. But that's an important distinction between that and the unified data governance, which is a whole other solution set that you have some tools to help you identify, alert, and protect the data that's in the Azure side of the house. Azure Storage, SQL databases, and even some third-party SaaS products out there like Amazon S3. We'll not focus on this today. We're focusing mainly here on the risk and compliance side of things. Okay. All right. An important thing to consider as we talk and tackle certain scenarios for today. As someone who focuses a lot on security and securing tenants and Azure AD, identities, data, right? We know the tools that are out there, and we know that to configure some of these things is actually not too difficult. The difficulty becomes the productivity effects of what we're trying to implement. So a few examples here on the screen, right, that you see around security. So we can create conditional access policies that can protect sensitive data. We can create DLP policies that basically block sharing to organizations or groups within our organization that shouldn't be seeing or accessing specific types of data, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also an important part of all this planning and discovery is that we also recognize that we don't want to bring workflows to a halt, and we want to make people productive, right? So there are steps, there are things to do to ease your organization into these products. And so some of those that you'll see listed here is the ability for people to apply sensitivity labels, which are classification labels, to both files and emails. There's the ability to enable tooltips to basically guide people to recognize that if in an email or in a file, there's social security numbers, credit card numbers, sensitive information in them, they'll get a little tooltip that says, hey, we recommend that you label this content, this file or email as XYZ, okay? So you ease your organization into these tools through the configuration of them, and you mature within them. You phase them in, and that allows for just a better adoption of just your overall tool set when it comes to your compliance and governance abilities. Okay. All right, so to dive deep into, or a little deeper into a particular tool set, we have information protection. Okay, information protection is one of several tools that leverage sensitive information types, which I'll talk about more in detail here in just a second. But sensitive information type is a credit card number, a social security card, social security number, things like that. And it is pattern based. So there's a regular expression or function that is used on the back end to recognize those types of information. Okay. Trainable classifiers is another set of an information type that allows you as an organization to basically take types of documents, such as statements of work, invoices, work orders, something of that sort, and you upload those into a location. AI, machine learning kind of take that and analyze those documents to see what patterns that are in those particular documents. And usually there's a combination of legitimate documents you upload and one that would be ones in that aren't matching the set of documents that you're expecting to train the system on, so that you can later mark those as false, and then you go through that process to then apply it to policies to classify actual data in your environment. Okay. Labels, data classification. There's another term that you'll see in Microsoft's world called sensitivity labels, which you'll see quite often, are essentially what you can use to tag or classify documents and emails. And then you have policies that you create to make those labels available to your organization, and whether that's just to emails or a combination of emails and your other Office documents that you work with. PDFs also are supported. All right, so to dive a little bit deeper into sensitive information types, there's a few reasons to understand these, and really it's because it's used in several different feature sets. Data loss prevention, which Reese will talk about, retention policies, which Ben will talk about, and also information protection. There's 300 plus built-in sensitive information types that Microsoft has that you can leverage. They're pre-built. Some of them are packaged by different regulations. So there's a GDPR one that can be built in for a policy, and it leverages several different sensitive information types to build out that policy. Named entity sensitive information types are newer, but these are more specific to some information like people's names, physical addresses, or medical terms and conditions. And then there's others that are a little more specific that are getting built out, like Australian addresses, right? So it's actually going to look at Australia's addresses, dictionaries that Microsoft has on the back end, and can actually identify if it's an Australian address. More to come. I've seen a lot of these built out over the past few months. So if you're in the process of building out DLP policies, retention policies, be aware that a lot of these named entities are being built out by Microsoft and being made available to augment some of the other information types and regulation templates that exist in the tool set. You can also create custom sensitive information types using regular expression, keyword dictionaries, and functions. There's functions that are out of the box that Microsoft has that you can leverage to build your own custom sensitive information types. And then we have exact data match. So in short, not to go into too much detail here because there is a lot to talk about there, but think about a table with a header and several different rows. Headers showing what piece of metadata is associated with a particular row that has several different values. And so exact data match basically is something that identifies an item that matches a criteria in a particular row or table. So that could be also very valuable for organizations that need very precise information identified in their documents or emails. So all of this is to help you identify what you have in your environment. So the whole discovery phase of this. It allows you then to classify documents based off of those sensitive information types that exist. And additionally, you can then grow into this protection phase, which you'll see synonymously used with the word encryption. You can encrypt data, files, emails, and there's feature sets that allow you to do that. Okay. So sensitivity labels or classification labels are used within files and emails. So just as examples here, this is a Word document. There is a sensitivity button in the ribbon. Depending on your organization, if they have deployed sensitivity labels or not, this may be grayed out and you won't have it enabled. If you do have it enabled, you'll see some classifications, much like these ones here, that may show up for you. And hopefully your org has trained you on what those mean so that you're able to classify and use them as they were intended to. Outlook, email, same thing. These are the client apps, so these are also available in the web browser. And I'll show you that here in just a second. It's not just client applications where you see these. All right. Additionally, there's content markings that could be configured by your admins to add watermarks, headers, footers, to identify visually that a document has a specific classification. And then also encryption or protection, and that's optional. And that is another feature that's nice to have as you progress within this information protection toolset. There is another set of labels still under the sensitivity labels umbrella that can be configured for groups and sites. And when you see groups here, it's Microsoft 365 groups, okay? So this is where in Azure AD, you could classify an M365 group with a classification that you've configured. Additionally, here's the view for a SharePoint administrator in the SharePoint admin portal of where that would show up, because it's also tied to that Microsoft 365 group. And then additionally, if your organization allows people to create teams within the Teams client, that becomes a question when you spin up a new team. And there are settings tied to these specific labels that you can configure as an administrator. Really quickly, one of them is privacy. So do we want internal collaboration groups to be all considered private? You can set that up that way consistently across the board. Whenever somebody creates a group or a team, they are all private. You have to join them through an invitation. An owner has to add you to it. It's not just willy-nilly. You can find the group and join it if you want. Other features like external access. You can lock down the ability for people to be able to collaborate with external parties. As you guys know, you can add guest users to teams. And so if we want to lock down and be sure that internal collaboration groups truly are just internal, that's another feature that you can configure so that across the board, all of those groups have that setting. And you don't have to worry about the possibility of data leaving that particular group and being shared with an external identity. Okay. All right, so I'm going to skip this, seeing that I took quite a bit of time, and move on to Reese, and we'll leave a little demo time towards the end. Reese.
All right, so we are diving into data loss prevention. A big part of data loss prevention is that it's part of a story. You need to know what data you have inside your organization. Like Hector was saying, most businesses have tons of data that they have not quite got to understanding or labeling, or even that they know that it exists. And so knowing what data you have allows you to define how you want to protect that data. There's a couple different strategies you can employ: encryption, blocking, policy tips like we mentioned earlier. And then that ultimately leads you to be able to prevent that data loss. And you're looking for risky behavior and accidental oversharing of sensitive information, along with bad actors in your systems getting access and working to exfiltrate data or leverage your platform to send out their own information. So we're going to dive into the data loss prevention tooling inside of the Purview compliance portal. So we're going to dive in first here. So there is a interesting hypothetical situation, which is one single email full of data. So when you have employees that have access to sensitive data inside your organization, there's an interesting thing that can happen where the employee often is trained to deal with that sensitive data in a specific way. And so a situation that we've talked about before is an email that's full of data. And what happens is inside that email, there's a list of social security numbers. This information needs to be transferred to a third party. Put it in an Excel spreadsheet. Easy, normal, standard business practice. What happens when that employee says, I'm going to attach it to an email, I'm going to send that externally, and then I'm going to take on a new role down the road? That email with all those social security numbers in the sent items folder for that user. No system in place to detect that email, that it's sitting inside of your system. That employee is no longer handling sensitive data and is not up to date on trainings and how to label and deal with sensitive data in the workplace. Fast forward 7 years later, and an interesting thing could happen. This piece of data sitting in a mailbox somewhere out inside of your systems, the employee, if they fall prey to a phishing attack where their credentials get compromised, that piece of data that's in their mailbox becomes in scope for an investigation. So since it's a social security number, and especially if your firm lives inside of a financial or healthcare or credit card processing space, and you have to deal with the regulations that Hector mentioned earlier, where you're looking at things like PHI and PCI and all of the different protections around. That attack has the potential to access this sensitive data that's been stored on your systems and sent elsewhere. And so this one piece of data can hypothetically make you need to be involved with government agencies to review the action and activities that that happened during the access that was not by the employee themselves. And what can happen is that the start of that conversation is I didn't even know that email existed in our system. I didn't know that we were keeping it around for 7 years after the activity that was a business process to send this information elsewhere. And I didn't know that this business process was actively being used by more than one person at the company. And this one email full of data could potentially cause hundreds of hours of work, hundreds of thousands of dollars of remediation in order to secure your environment, reduce your data footprint, and understand the data that's in your systems. So organizations that go through this type of situation, those I don't knows, when you go to third-party companies that you work with or to government agencies, are difficult. And the response is always, how could you have known? What can you do today to implement and protect yourself better? And it takes a lot of time to come back from a incident where your data, that you didn't prevent it going out or you didn't understand what's in your environment. So digging into that a little further of how would we implement a policy to detect a business process that is generating lists of social security numbers that are sent to a third party, and jump in and say, hey, maybe we should label this differently. Maybe we should change our business process. Maybe we should destroy this information after a certain period of time. So in the Purview data loss prevention dashboard, you'll go to compliance.microsoft.com. Scroll down on the left. And you'll see a data loss prevention section. We're going to be focusing on policies today and alerts. And you can create policies there. The idea that when you go to create a policy, there are some out-of-the-box ones. There's some built in to, depends on when you created your Office 365 tenant and when you applied your licensing to it. There are some out of the box, or you can use the templates that are provided when you go to create a new policy. And so here I'm going to be talking about a category called enhanced, and we're going to dive into the personally identifiable information, which includes the US Social Security number information that we're looking for. I like to filter this down when you create a new policy to the United States of America. It makes things a little more relevant and things that you're familiar with. Okay, you'll go through naming it. I like to tag the location in the name. As we build policies, Microsoft tooling has the capability of applying to multiple locations, Teams, OneDrive, SharePoint, etc., all at the same time. If there's if you choose to select all the different locations, which is the default, you lose access to some more advanced features that are specific to Exchange or specific to Teams. So we're going to do a specific Exchange policy. We're going to go through and uncheck all of those other locations. And like I mentioned, it's better to focus in on a specific policy or a specific location. You can change this to SharePoint, or you can change it to Teams, depending on what you're trying to focus on. This is pretty powerful to focus in on one and get your policy configured into something that really makes sense for what you're trying to accomplish. You'll define your policy settings. You can use the templates here or start from scratch. And you can define whether you're looking for when it's sent outside or inside your organization. There's an edit here, and this is a little bit interesting. On the new policy creation, you get an edit feature where you can go in and look at all the different policies that are in the all the different pieces inside the policy. I don't love this wizard in here. I'm going to dive into it just to show you what it looks like from the new policy creation. I usually look at it from after the policy is created, you go back in to edit it and you get a little bit more features and granularity. But if you were to just edit it right in this new policy creation, you'll have the opportunity to define some confidence levels for the things that you're looking for, how many instances you're looking for, and if you're combining that with other types of information. So we talk about sensitive info types. You can define labels that you have defined in your organization, trainable classifiers, like Hector was mentioning. What we've learned is that out of the box, it's going to assume that there's very low numbers of data in your org. I like to bump these up and start high and work down. This can bring in a lot of data as you turn it on for the first time. Additionally, a lot of these combinations of things wouldn't pop up in the specific use case that you're looking for. I'm specifically looking for your social security numbers and large volumes of them. So I'm going to go ahead and change that to, I'm going to remove all the other options, change it just to social security numbers with high confidence, and do 500 to any. 500 is the maximum you can define. Any will do anything above that. So if you have an Excel spreadsheet with 1,000 social security numbers on it, it would trigger this policy. High confidence is interesting here. If you hover over these tooltips here, it'll dive you into the documentation where it talks about what makes it high confidence. We've seen things with social security numbers and driver's license numbers that those often look very similar to meeting join IDs. And so putting this to high confidence can help filter those out so that you're not accidentally marking every single Zoom meeting as a suspected social security number exfiltration. So high confidence, 500 to any, remove the other options. You're going to go through and choose protection actions. This kind of mixes in a few things. We're going to dive into this later when we look at the policy once it's created. But they're sending incident reports and alerts, and you can select that when content matches the policy, show policy tips to users and send them email notifications. So a lot of alerting that's happening here. There's also a button here for restricting access or encrypting. This can be a little misleading in this dashboard. I like to set those actions once you've created the policy and go into the full one. So you'll set up some restrictions here, just general ones. You can block everyone. You can let the people override the policy. Once again, you can leave this box unchecked or check it here and then adjust it once you get into the policy. So I like to use the test out first capability with policy tips. That will help you put in information into your Office apps and see it pop up in real time. In a Word document, you can make sure that you have the DLP agent, type in information that would match your policy, a list of 1,000 generated test social security numbers, etc., and see this policy tip trigger. And you get an opportunity to review it. And then you'll have this policy down here that you've just created when test mode with notifications. Selecting this and hitting the edit pencil icon is going to let you dive into it. Now, this is something that's kind of interesting. Inside of this policy, there's actually 2 different rules that it creates. This can be confusing. I like to drop down to 1 rule until you're ready to build down to 2, and then go into the rule itself and define and make sure that your values that you put in here are correct. I have seen this happen where you set the values to something that you want them to be 100, 200, and they don't save. And so going back in and reviewing these is very helpful. Setting them to the correct value, make sure that everything matches what you expect it to. You'll take an action. This is really powerful to protect. You can redirect the message if it detects to a different mailbox, or you can deliver it to the quarantine for admin review. Either one of these would get that message into the view of an administrator to review the data and understand the business process. These actions will only take effect once you move the policy out of test to enable. So as you go through setting up the notifications, you'll have the ability to notify users with a policy tip. customize the email text, customize the email subject, and customize that policy tip text. As you alert on these, you'll provide some information to the system, to the DLP policy, when that policy is triggered, where it will show the content of the email. You can also set up a incident report where that's going to get generated and sent to a place for review later. I like to take the default site admin off and use a shared mailbox here. And so I take a shared mailbox that I've created, DLP policy incident reports, and set that up as my testing ground for all the notifications to go to. This can be helpful because you can, if you get a wave of these in, say 200 detections, it's not going to fill up your main mailbox or your site admin's mailbox. It shows site admin there because there's a feature where whoever's the owner of the team or the SharePoint site, if you're using those locations, it will automatically notify them of that piece of information. So you can add site admin and this one. I would only do that after you've tested and understood how many alerts you're going to get on a regular basis. If you get one a month, that's easy. Sure, send it to the site admin. If you're getting 200 a day, you'll want those in a separate space that you can easily clean out and that won't overwhelm your main inbox. So once you've got those alerts set up and that policy in place, you'll get alerts in the data loss prevention dashboard where you can see the event, who performed it, what policy it matched, and how many number of events it happened that were in that event. Sometimes it can match on multiple policies or have multiple different things inside of that content that will make that number of events go up higher. Something that has a higher number of events is more interesting than lower. And you're looking for the biggest threat. So start at high and work your way down. As you dig into these, it'll show more information about the event and what triggered it, what time it was. You'll see data around who the recipients were, which is very helpful. And you'll see the actual source view of the content. This is a pretty powerful tool and role, so you want to restrict this to people that are in this job role to review content with social security numbers, credit card numbers, sensitive information. When you go into that sensitive info type, you'll see what type. So we define social security number as the type in our test policy that we created, but it'll show you what exactly the data was and the surrounding characters, which is super helpful identifying what in the policy was triggered. So we see commonly that selecting more than one location causes confusion. You're missing features that are talked about in the documentation. An aggressive policy where it's like, I want to know every email that has a single social security number in it or a single PHI piece of information. PHI or PII and PHI are pretty interesting because just the fact that an email has a name, which often you have a signature and a telephone number and possibly a business address, those would all trigger on PII and PHI. So setting those policies to very aggressive value where single detection, you'll just catch every email in your system. It's not helpful. It'll start to build a lot of alerts in your system and it's difficult to clean those out after the fact. So make sure to start high and keep your values high and then work your way down. We've worked with companies to start at 500 any and then work down to 300, 200, 100, 50 detections. Okay, we're understanding where the right business processes are triggering these and we're understanding what that data looks like. Build in a path for understanding the specifics of the data. A lot of times like a form attached to an email can be complicated because it's going to trigger a lot of things because it has health terms in it or it has credit card terms in it, financial terms. When you go into edit those values, make sure to save, exit, and reopen to make sure that they save. And you'll understanding your processes that you have in your business today, super critical. It may be best, or it may be the current process for someone in HR to send onboarding information for an employee that includes their social security number to the third-party benefits vendor. That's a normal business case. They're using email to do it. detect on it, understand that that's going on in your org, and then work to say, is this the right thing for our business? Are we keeping that data? How long are we keeping that data for? Are we encrypting that data as it goes out? There's a lot of interesting things you can do once you understand the pockets of business processes that are working with sensitive data. Make sure it's focusing on the single location, and then look for those biggest offenders. We've not been surprised when we go into an organization, turn on the 500 ANI, and that triggers once a month with some piece of data that is being transacted around social security numbers, credit card numbers, or personal information. Lists of employee rosters with phone numbers and home addresses for gift cards and holiday cards. That's all information that would fall under the categories in the classifications. Doing the shared mailbox is very helpful so it doesn't overwhelm your main one, and make sure that you understand where you actually need to focus in on. Just the idea that you're wanting to protect against sensitive info, start with the contractual requirements first. If you have a PCI compliance audit, do that first. If you want to understand where people are transacting around project top secret, do that last, right? Whatever's the most important thing at the time, focus in on that and get that figured out. And the alert dashboard it's helpful to define that as a job responsibility for someone on the team, that they're in there weekly, understanding what's going on. At the beginning, it'll be a lot, and then it'll taper off to not be a huge lift. But defining a point person for an alert to come in to go in and respond to that is very helpful. What we've seen, employee onboarding, I talked about. Benefits coordination, I've talked about. Forms. Things with healthcare and payments. This is kind of interesting. We see a lot with wire information that pop up in here as you're processing vendor payments and contracts, detecting on those, making sure that those informations are going to the right third parties, and that they're centrally being managed by like an accounts payable or accounts receivable is helpful. Employee rosters, and we've seen thousands of social security numbers or credit cards come up in a single Excel spreadsheet. And that's not like a single event. That's like a business process where you're onboarding different clients and you bring in those pieces of data, and those are all being floated around and could be encrypted or could be done monitored for any accidental misuse. Okay, so once again, knowing your data, protecting your data, that all comes into an implementation phase where you're implementing the configuration according to the requirements you define. That, we'll turn it over to Ben for data lifecycle management.
Thanks, Reese. All right. So to start things off, first of all, what is data lifecycle management? So I would sum this up in 2 words: retention, deletion. So it is the governance around your data and retaining it based on those regulations and other laws that Hector had mentioned earlier, and making sure that data gets deleted after that retention period. So why is that important? A couple of reasons. One, those industry laws mentioned earlier. And 2, I would say one of the more important parts of data lifecycle is making sure data you no longer need is deleted when it reaches that retention period. For example, let's say you have a bunch of stale data that has reached its retention period. You end up not deleting it, and then a security breach comes along. In that case, now all of that stale data that you don't need to retain any longer is available for that security breach or to that attacker. And now you're bringing your company in for more risk. So that's one of the very important pieces and reasons why we need to have data lifecycle management and to have retention and deletion. On top of that, as you delete the data, we've seen a lot of clients where they'll come to us and they'll have 20 years worth of data in their systems. And a lot of that data is living in normal everyday locations. So users are having to go and sift through all of these documents and folders from 15, 20 years ago that they don't need to retain any longer, and making their lives harder. So really, by retaining and deleting, you're going to help make your organization more effective and mitigate a lot of those risks. So in Microsoft 365, there's a couple tool sets that Microsoft Purview provides that assists with this process. One of them is data lifecycle management. The other one is records management. These two things really collide quite a bit and have a lot of overlap. So we're going to talk about them all in unison together as one set of features. So in that left side, you'll notice retention policies. So retention policies are really around container retention periods of time. So these retention policies, what they do is you can set up a policy around a container of content, such as a SharePoint site, a Microsoft 365 group, an Exchange mailbox, a OneDrive account. And so you set a retention period for that container, and everything that's contained in the container will also inherit that retention period. So if a SharePoint site has a 5-year retention period or a 5-year retention policy, all of the documents within it would have that same retention. Another feature that's in there is retention labels. So retention labels are intended for item level retention. So for example, we may set up a retention policy on a SharePoint site for all of the content in there, but we may have specific documents that require item level retention or varying levels of retention because of the information that it contains. So with retention labels, what you can do is you can specify item specific retention labels or retention periods so that they get retained for a longer or shorter period of time. And finally, we'll also talk about that disposition review. So at the end of a retention period, you may also want to go through and check that the retention on that specific document or email or group was the correct period before that finally gets deleted. And I know we're running a little close on time, so we're going to skip some of the demo that we had. And we'll just show some high-level features here. So within Microsoft Purview, you'll notice here in the Purview Center on the left-hand side, there's this data lifecycle management solution. And in this data lifecycle management, this is where you'll be able to manage retention policies. And to the right of that, you'll notice the labels. Within these policies, what you can do is you can set up scopes. And also for the labels, you can set up scopes as well to apply these retention periods. So on these retention periods, you can manually set the retention policies or labels onto specific sites, or you can dynamically or automatically apply them. So Hector earlier today, he mentioned about sensitive info types and trainable classifiers. You can actually use those things to automatically apply retention policies and retention periods based on what sensitive info types are contained within your content or within the data of a document or email. So a very nice feature to have. We're going to jump around a little bit. And talk a little bit about disposition as well. So with disposition, at the end of a retention period, prior to deleting your content, so with your retention labels, what you can do is you can configure a retention period, and at the end of the retention period, you can trigger what's called a disposition. So what that means is it will trigger an alert to a certain reviewer. That could be a group of people, it could be a specific person. They'll go into Microsoft Purview, they'll review the content, make sure it's past its retention period, and will then give their approval for that content to be deleted. So a nice little feature to have just to review and make sure your retention is correct within your organization. And finally, just some general retention rules to live by when implementing it within your organization. So first and foremost, when you're setting up retention, keep what you need and delete what you don't. Remove everything that could cause risks for you down the road. So how that's the process to set that up is to understand how retention and deletion works for your Microsoft 365 services. If you don't understand it, I would highly advise you to work with somebody who does know, reach out to us. there are some adverse effects that can happen if you just start playing around with retention policies and retention labels. So make sure you understand how these things work in your Microsoft 365 tenant. Once you do have that understanding, start by creating retention policies, the higher level retention periods. Those are the simpler, more easy to manage things to use. And when needed, go to create those retention labels. Retention labels are more granular, a little bit harder to work with, but they're very powerful. So if you do need the retention labels, that's when we start managing what we'll call the high value items here on the right. So with those, you're going to want to make sure that your retention labels are set up and configured correctly. So there's a tool set in Microsoft Purview called File Plan. So let's say you have a bunch of retention labels that you want to create and set up. Microsoft sets up an easy way to mass produce retention labels. So if that's a need for your organization, that's something that Microsoft does provide. Once you set up all of these retention labels, you then want to make it so they're available for all of your end users to use or for the specific admins that you need to be able to use them. And after you've applied them, you'll also want to make sure to manage the deletion or the disposition of your data once it's reached the end of its life cycle. So in a nutshell, keep what you need, delete what you don't, and make sure you understand how retention works in Microsoft 365.